She'd always liked her apartment, even if it was small. 2 rooms and a narrow galley kitchen, one old radiator that clanked in winter, windows that rattled when the city buses rumbled past outside. But it was hers. No cosigner, no second name on the lease, no secret IOUs hidden in drawers. She paid every month on time, stacked her extra cash in a savings account her brother always rolled his eyes at when she talked about it. When their mother's birthday rolled around that year, she offered, maybe against her better judgment, to host the family dinner at her place. The apartment might have been small, but it was warm. She'd scrubbed the stove spotless, hung new curtains, even splurged on fresh flowers for the wobbly dining table. She told herself it didn't matter what they'd think, but she fussed over every detail anyway. They showed up early, her mother carrying a cake in a cardboard box, her father lugging a big bag of paper plates. And then, of course, her brother. He swept in last, the way he always did, booming his "Hey, there's the birthday girl," like the star of a show only he could headline. He brought his new girlfriend, a pretty woman with impossibly sleek hair who looked around her little living room with polite curiosity. It started off fine, if you didn't look too closely. They squeezed around the table, plates balanced on laps, laughing over old family stories. But it didn't take long for him to start the little digs that slid in under the cover of a joke. He pushed aside her mismatched chair with a smirk. "Man, forgot how tight it is in here. Careful, babe, if you breathe too hard you'll knock over that lamp." The girlfriend giggled, too new to know it wasn't really funny. She ignored him at first, kept the smile fixed on her face as she refilled their mother's cup of tea, cut extra slices of cake. But it stung more than she'd admit, the way he leaned back and draped his arm across the top of his chair, taking up space like he owned the place, then turning to their parents with that smug grin. "Bet you're glad you're not stuck in a shoebox like this, huh? Wait till you see my new patio. Twice the size of this whole apartment." Their mother shushed him half-heartedly. "Now, don't start." But he kept going, waving his fork like a pointer. "She's always talking about saving, saving, saving. For what? You gotta enjoy your life. You could get a nicer place if you'd loosen up a little. Or maybe you like the cozy vibe." The word cozy dripped off his tongue like poison. She laughed it off because that's what you do in front of family. You nod, pour more tea, say maybe one day. But her face burned. She caught her father's eyes dart away, embarrassed for her but not enough to speak up. The girlfriend said nothing, just reached for another slice of cake and looked at the ceiling. After they'd gone, hugs and air kisses at the door, promises of next time at ours, that she knew she'd dread, she closed the door and leaned against it. The quiet in her little place settled around her like a blanket and a bruise all at once. The sink was stacked with plates. Crumbs speckled her old thrifted rug. She stared at the dent his boot had left in the baseboard by the door. One careless kick, and it'd be another thing she'd fix alone. She went to the kitchen, poured herself the last splash of cheap wine from the bottle she'd hidden behind the cereal boxes. She sipped it standing by the window, looking out over the streetlights and the crooked row of parked cars. He'd always been that way, the big man with the big house and the big mouth. She'd always been the quiet one in the corner, counting her dollars like it was something shameful. But as she watched the lights flicker in the building across the street, a thought sparked in her mind. Small at first, almost silly. But it grew. Her tiny apartment was hers. Every square inch of peeling paint and squeaky floorboard belonged to her alone. His big house? She wondered what the papers said about that. She wondered how sturdy his big laugh would sound if someone pulled the rug out from under it. She rinsed her glass, turned out the kitchen light, and went to bed with that spark still glowing somewhere deep in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but she'd never let him talk down to her again, not without paying for it. She didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't the usual racing worry, the mental math about the rent, the utilities, the what-ifs of an emergency that could swallow up her savings overnight. No, that part was always there, humming like a refrigerator in the back of her mind. This was different. It was the echo of his laughter, the smirk on his face as he looked around her little living room like it was a waiting room he couldn't stand to sit in. She'd seen that look 100 times over the years. Growing up, he'd always been the one to take up all the space in a room. He'd been their mother's bright star, their father's little man, the one with the trophies lined up on the shelf, the one who went away to college while she stayed home and worked double shifts at the diner to save up for community classes. He'd come home with expensive jeans and stories about frat parties, telling her she could do better if she just tried harder, as if the universe handed out scholarships and six-figure jobs to girls who didn't have anyone else to lean on. She thought of her first apartment. Not even this one, the one before, the basement unit with peeling linoleum floors and a single window that looked out at the bottom of a stairwell. She'd worked nights back then, scrubbing tables until her back ached. He'd shown up once, back when she was still naive enough to believe he might be proud of her. He'd wrinkled his nose at the musty smell and told her she was wasting her life. "Why not just move back in with Mom and Dad until you find a real job," he'd said, like the taste of independence wasn't worth every penny she scraped together. It hadn't changed much when they were older. He'd gotten lucky, or maybe just louder. He knew the right people, landed a cushy office gig that paid for the house he bragged about at every family holiday. The granite countertops, the in-ground pool, the shiny mortgage he swore he'd pay off faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, she watched her bank balance grow at a snail's pace, too cautious to risk it all on something she couldn't afford. Too tired to chase shortcuts that might eat her alive if they went wrong. And yet, she'd never envied him. Not really. Not until he made her feel small for being careful. Not until he turned what she built with sweat and worry into a punchline he tossed out between bites of birthday cake. She thought about the sacrifices she'd made for that tiny apartment. How many times she'd said no to vacations, to nights out she couldn't justify when the electric bill needed paying. How she'd learned to patch a leaky faucet on her own, to scrub mildew off the bathroom walls, to fix the closet door that always stuck in the summer humidity. How she'd woken up on freezing mornings when the heat sputtered out, wrapped herself in blankets, and told herself it was worth it, every bit of it, because at least it was hers. Her brother didn't know that feeling. He knew how to swing his big keys around, how to show off the new car in the driveway. But he didn't know the relief of seeing a rent receipt stamped paid with no help from anyone. He didn't know what it meant to breathe in walls that belonged only to you, no cosigner, no secrets, no debts waiting to snapshot like a bear trap. She sat up in bed as dawn crept through the thin curtains. The city outside was still quiet, the street lights blinking off one by one. In that pale blue silence, she felt the sting of his insults slip away, replaced by something harder. Something older. He'd spent years treating her like the backup plan, the family's soft spot to land when he needed to look good by comparison. But maybe it was time to remind him that she'd never needed him, and that his big house wasn't as untouchable as he thought. She went to work the next morning like she always did, commuter mug in hand, headphones in, shoulders squared to face the day. She was good at her job, better than most people knew. She managed files, coordinated vendors, kept books so clean the partners at her small property management firm trusted her with details they wouldn't hand to each other. She'd spent years watching investors wheel and deal, buy houses for pennies on the dollar when someone fell behind, flip contracts faster than she could brew a pot of break room coffee. She'd always told herself she wasn't like them. She didn't want to be. She liked her steady paycheck, her carefully budgeted rent, her small cushion of savings. It felt safe, boring maybe, but safe. But all day, as she filed paperwork and answered emails, his words echoed in her head. "Careful, you'll knock over the lamp. You gotta enjoy your life." His smirk had wormed its way under her skin like a splinter she couldn't dig out. It would have been easy to let it go. She'd done it 1,000 times before. But that afternoon, as she sipped her third stale cup of coffee and logged into the county property tax records for a routine work request, the thought flickered, what if you didn't let it go this time? On a whim, she typed his address into the database. She knew it by heart, he made sure everyone did. That big, boxy house in the suburbs with the custom stonework he'd bragged about on Facebook. The screen loaded slowly, the details lining up in rows she'd read a million times for other people's houses. Except this time, it was personal. She didn't expect to see the late fees. The missed payments stacked up like dominoes about to topple. The mortgage wasn't in his name alone, it never had been. It was a bundle, part of an adjustable rate loan that looked impressive when he signed for it but turned vicious when the market dipped and his fancy job didn't cover the bills. She clicked through the documents, each line clearer than the last. Her brother, the one who mocked her for her shoebox, was one bounce check away from losing the house he couldn't shut up about. She sat back in her chair, heartbeat steady in her chest. She could practically hear him spinning stories about how it was temporary, how the bank would work with him. She knew better. She'd watched the firm's partners scoop up homes like his before, distressed properties tied up in messy loans, just waiting for someone with the money and the nerve to pry them loose. She closed the window quickly when her manager walked by, offered a polite smile, and went back to pretending she was buried in invoices. But inside, something was different. For once, the careful voice in her head, the one that always said, "Be good, keep your head down, don't make waves," went quiet. When she got home, she flipped through her files for the first time not just as a tenant, but as someone who might hold the pen instead of waiting for someone else to sign. She'd been careful all her life, so careful that she'd built up a small nest egg bigger than anyone in her family even guessed. She'd always told herself it was for an emergency. For a medical bill, a broken-down car, a job loss. But maybe this was the emergency. Not the missed payments, his problem, not hers, but the final straw that would keep him from ever using her tiny apartment as his punchline again. She didn't need to embarrass him publicly. She didn't need to fight him in the driveway or air dirty laundry at the next family dinner. She could do it the way she'd done everything, quietly, carefully, with every detail in her favor. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, the hum of city buses rolling by her window. Her place was still small, still imperfect, still fully hers. And if she did this right, soon a piece of his big life would be hers too, just enough to remind him that mocking her stability had cost him the thing he cared about most. She spent the next week moving through her days with a calm so steady it almost frightened her. She smiled through meetings at work, double-checked invoices, took the calls that kept her team organized, all the while carrying the secret in her pocket like a match ready to be struck. Each evening she came home to her tiny apartment, the one he'd sneered at, and turned it into her war room. Her kitchen table was soon buried in folders, printouts from the county recorder's office, old notes she'd scribbled during lunch breaks. She combed through every line of his mortgage details, every name on the paperwork, every scrap of info she could legally get her hands on. She knew enough from her job to understand how it worked. Banks didn't always want to be in the landlord business. They liked payments on time. They liked good credit, clean accounts, no drama. And when someone like her brother fell behind, they'd quietly bundle that debt, sell it to investors who were willing to take the risk. For the right price, the note could change hands without him ever knowing who really held the strings. She found an old business card tucked in a drawer, the number for Mark, a local real estate investor she'd met at a work function last year. She'd never taken his chatter seriously then. He'd talked about foreclosure auctions the way some people talk about winning scratch-offs. But now she saw the value in that calm ruthlessness. When she called him, her voice only shook once. "I have a question," she said, pacing her living room, the floorboards creaking under her bare feet. "Hypothetically, if someone wanted to buy a mortgage note on a single-family home, could you help them find out who owns it?" Mark laughed. "Hypothetically? I could probably tell you what color the walls are. Whose house are we talking about?" She hesitated, then said her brother's name. She waited for the mocking that never came. Instead, Mark just whistled through his teeth. "Big place. Nice street. Yeah, that's a mess right now. People don't think the market's gonna dip, but it always does. That's how we make our money." They met for coffee the next day. She wore her best blazer, the same one she'd worn to her last promotion meeting. Mark brought spreadsheets and contacts and a string of hushed suggestions. There was nothing illegal about it, it was just business. The bank didn't care who sent the check. And once she owned the note, she'd own the debt. If he wanted to stay in his big house, he'd have to play by her rules and pay for the privilege. After Mark left, she sat in her car in the cafe parking lot, staring out the windshield at the gray sky. It felt strange, almost cold, to realize how easy it would be. But that chill in her bones was the same chill she'd felt every time he'd leaned in with that smug grin, every time he'd made her feel like her careful life was something to be ashamed of. When she got home that night, she opened her savings app. The numbers glowed back at her: years of skipped vacations, hand-me-down furniture, thrift store jackets, all piled up into a sum he'd always dismissed as hoarding. She wondered what he'd say if he knew she'd become the bank he couldn't pay back. She called Mark the next morning. Her voice didn't shake at all this time. "Let's do it," she said. "But keep it clean. Keep it quiet." He promised he would. After all, there was no fun in a loud revenge. The satisfaction came in silence, in the moment he'd open that envelope, read her name, and realize who held the deed to his pride. She hung up, walked to her tiny window, and pushed it open just wide enough to let in the city's cold autumn air. Her apartment still rattled when the buses passed. The radiator still clanked. It was small, but it was paid for. It was hers. And soon, a piece of his world would be hers too. When the envelope arrived at his mailbox, she knew exactly what day he'd find it. She'd timed it down to the hour, slipping the notice into the pile of ordinary bills and grocery flyers he probably tossed aside without looking, until he saw the crisp, official letterhead that made his stomach drop. She pictured it so clearly, him standing in that fancy kitchen he'd shown off in 100 family photos, marble countertops cold under his hands as he tore the letter open. Maybe he'd read the words twice, not quite believing it. The polite legal tone spelling out what he'd ignored for months, that the mortgage on his beloved house wasn't just behind, but sold. The note now belonged to a new holder. And the new holder had decided it was time to make some changes. She almost wished she could have seen his face when he read her name. But then again, she liked the silence better. No yelling match. No show. Just the heavy weight of reality settling in his chest. The first call came within the hour. Her phone buzzed where it lay on the kitchen table next to her chipped mug of tea. She let it ring to voicemail. He called again. And again. By the fourth attempt, she answered, her voice steady as a stone. "What the hell is this?" he barked without even saying hello. "No, how are you?" No apology for that night he'd stood in this very apartment and laughed at her walls. Just the panic of a man whose big house wasn't so big anymore. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a pen between her fingers. "It's business," she said calmly. "You know, the same thing you always brag about. Just business." He sputtered, trying to wrap his head around it. You can't do this. This is my house." She almost smiled. "Not anymore, technically. You live there, but you don't own it outright. You still owe. And you're behind." He went quiet. She could hear his breathing, the same heavy huff she'd listened to 1,000 times when he was gearing up to mock her for being cautious, for being cheap. He'd always made her feel like playing it safe was a weakness. Now that weakness was his leash. "I can catch up," he said finally, his tone desperate. Just lower the payments. Be reasonable. We're family." Family. She let that word roll through her mind. Family was him showing up with that smug grin, calling her shoebox apartment a joke. Family was their parents looking away when he made her small for no reason other than he could. Family was her mother shrugging helplessly when he bragged about his new car while she counted pennies for her rent. "The new terms are in the letter," she said, her voice calm, firm. "The rate goes up. Pay it or don't, your choice. You'd kick me out, he spat, voice climbing. Your own brother? Over money? She let out a short, cold laugh. You mocked me over money my entire life. Maybe you should have paid better attention to yours. He cursed. She let him. When he finally stopped, she spoke again, quieter this time, each word slicing through the bluster. You've got 30 days to bring it current. After that, we follow the contract. You signed it, not me. He tried to swing back to his old tricks, that fake charm that used to work when they were kids. Come on, be reasonable. You live in a matchbox. You don't need this money. She almost thanked him for that, for reminding her exactly why this was worth it. I need exactly what I've got, she said, voice steady. A roof that's mine. And the power to make sure no one treats me like dirt under their boots ever again. She hung up before he could answer. Let him stand there in his vaulted foyer, panicking about the bills he couldn't pay. Let him feel the walls closing in, the same way she'd felt his laughter squeeze her small year after year. She pushed her phone aside, picked up her mug, and sipped her tea while the radiator rattled behind her. Her tiny apartment felt bigger than ever. And he'd pay for every square foot of his, one way or another. When the final payment cleared, she sat on her old couch and watched the numbers update on her phone. It wasn't the biggest transaction she'd ever seen, not by the standards her brother loved to boast about at family dinners, the deals he used to brag about to anyone who'd listen. But this one wasn't about size. It was about proof. She'd always told herself there was power in being quiet, in minding her own business, in keeping her books balanced while other people flaunted theirs to hide what was missing. Now, the silence felt like a fortress instead of a cage. A week after the new terms kicked in, her brother called again, this time pretending he just wanted to check in. She almost laughed when she heard his forced lightness through the line, the same tone he'd once used to pat her on the head like a pet. He wanted to know if there was anything she'd consider, maybe a grace period, maybe a discount. He even threw in a half-hearted apology, but the words caught on the jagged edge of his pride. She let him talk, her phone propped between her shoulder and ear while she wiped down her thrifted kitchen table. She could see the paint peeling along the edge, a tiny chip that always snagged the sleeve of her sweater. It used to bother her, that imperfection. Now she thought it made the table feel real, honest in a way her brother's perfect house never was. When he finished his rambling plea, she set down her rag, leaned on the counter, and spoke as calmly as if she were talking about the weather. It's business, remember? You said it yourself 100 times, it's all about the deal. I gave you the deal. You didn't like it. That's not my problem. He made promises he couldn't keep, threats he didn't have the power to carry out. She didn't flinch. She'd spent her life letting him bend her into shapes that fit his story of himself, the successful one, the big man, the golden son. She'd given him years of looking the other way, taking the jokes, letting him have the last word at every holiday table. No more. This was her word. This was her boundary. This was the cost. When she hung up, she stood at her tiny window and watched the buses go by. Her building rattled every time a truck barreled past, the radiator still hissed like it was boiling off her old shame. She didn't feel small here anymore. Not when she knew she'd made the kind of choice he never could, patient, deliberate, powerful in its quiet. The new owners of his debt, her, didn't need to gloat about it. She didn't need to show up at the family Christmas with the paperwork pinned to her chest. She'd let him keep his mask on for everyone else if that made him feel better. Let him tell people he worked things out, that it was just a hiccup. She knew the truth, that every time he made that new payment, he'd remember whose name was on the check. She glanced around her small apartment, the faded rug she'd gotten secondhand, the couch that sagged a little in the middle, the chipped table she'd polished so many times it shone in the afternoon light. Everything here was humble, patched, imperfect. But it was hers, every inch of it paid for with her own careful hands. She turned off her phone, letting his last desperate messages blink away unread. She'd done what she came to do, remind him that mocking what he didn't understand had a price, and that she wasn't the soft place he could land on when his big life fell apart. She sat back down at her kitchen table, pulled her cup of tea closer, and let herself smile, not a mean smile, just one that felt clean and true. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't loud. Sometimes it was just a woman in a tiny apartment, debt-free, unbothered, with the keys to her own peace and the mortgage to his.